Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're diving deep into Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell. This book really blew my mind, and I think you're going to love the insights we pull out.
Sowell's work is always thought-provoking, and Basic Economics is a fantastic foundation for understanding how the world works.
Absolutely. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's give our listener a quick overview. Essentially, Sowell takes us on a journey through core economic principles, but he does it in such a clear and engaging way, using real-world examples to illustrate every point. He covers everything from prices and markets to the role of government and international trade.
And one of the things that makes this book so powerful is that Sowell doesn't just present the traditional economic theories. He challenges us to think critically about the assumptions behind those theories and the often unintended consequences of economic policies.
Right. He constantly encourages us to look beyond the surface and consider the bigger picture, which I really appreciated. Okay, so let's dive into Chapter 1, where Sowell sets the stage by explaining what economics is really all about. I have to admit,
Yeah.
when I first picked up this book, I thought it was going to be all about money, stock markets, and maybe some confusing graphs.
It's a common misconception. Sowell brilliantly shows us that economics is about so much more than that at its heart. It's about understanding the consequences of choices. We all have limited resources: time, money, energy. And every decision we make involves allocating those resources in some way. That's economics at play.
So even deciding whether to spend my Saturday binge-watching a show or going for a hike is an economic decision.
Exactly. You're choosing how to allocate your scarce resource of time. And those seemingly small choices, multiplied across millions of individuals, had a huge impact on how society functions.
Wow, I never thought about it that way. It's kind of mind-blowing when you start seeing economics everywhere.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things I love about Sowell's approach. He takes these abstract economic principles and makes them relevant to our everyday lives.
Okay, so in Chapter 2, Sowell dives into the role of prices. And he makes this really interesting point, that prices aren't just arbitrary numbers set by greedy businesses.
Right. What's fascinating here is that prices act as a kind of information system in a free market. They reflect the underlying forces of supply and demand, telling us what's scarce, what's in high demand, and what people are willing to pay.
So even if a business wanted to charge an outrageous price for something, they couldn't get away with it if nobody was willing to buy it at that price.
Exactly. The market would push the price down until it reached a level where buyers and sellers were both willing to make a deal. And this system works incredibly well, even when individuals are primarily motivated by self-interest. In fact, Sowell argues that it's precisely this pursuit of self-interest that drives the efficiency and innovation we see in a free market.
That's such a counterintuitive idea. We're often taught that selfishness is bad. But Sowell is saying that in the context of a market economy, it can actually lead to positive outcomes.
Precisely. Now, that doesn't mean that greed is good, or that we should ignore ethical considerations. But Sowell is pointing out that the market as a system can harness individual self-interest to produce benefits for society as a whole.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so moving on to Chapter 3, we get into the role of profits and losses. And this is where Sowell really challenges some common assumptions. We often hear about businesses striving for profit, but Sowell argues that losses are just as important.
That's a crucial point. Losses act as a signal, telling producers what's not working, what to stop producing, and where to redirect resources. They're like a feedback mechanism that keeps the market in check, weeding out inefficient businesses and guiding resources toward their most valued uses.
So a business going bankrupt isn't necessarily a bad thing for the economy as a whole.
Not necessarily. It can actually be a sign that the market is working, reallocating resources from less productive uses to more productive ones.
That's a really different way of looking at it. I think most people see business failures as a negative thing, but Sowell is saying it's all part of a dynamic process. That leads to greater efficiency and innovation over time.
Exactly. It's like a forest fire. While destructive in the short term, it clears out the underbrush, making way for new growth.
That's a great analogy. Okay, so let's talk about Chapter 4, where Sowell tackles the role of government in the economy. And I know this is an area where he's often seen as a controversial figure.
Yes, Sowell is a strong advocate for limited government intervention in the market. But it's important to understand his reasoning. He's not against all government involvement, but he believes that government's role should be primarily focused on creating a stable and predictable framework for economic activity.
So things like enforcing contracts, protecting property rights, and maintaining a stable currency.
Exactly. Those are the essential functions that allow markets to work efficiently. But Sowell argues that when governments try to control or manipulate markets, it often leads to unintended consequences that can actually harm the very people they're trying to help.
He uses some pretty compelling examples to illustrate this point, like rent control and minimum wage laws.
Right. He argues that while these policies may seem well-intentioned, they often lead to unintended consequences, like shortages, black markets, and even unemployment.
And this is where Sowell's emphasis on thinking about the unseen effects of policies really comes into play, right? He's always reminding us to consider not just the immediate visible effects of a policy, but also the ripple effects that may not be so obvious.
Absolutely. He wants us to think about the long-term consequences, the incentives that policies create, and the ways in which people might adjust their behavior in response to those incentives.
So it's like that famous quote from Frederick Bastiat, the bad economist sees only what is immediately visible to the naked eye. The good economist takes into account both what is seen and what is unseen.
Exactly. Sowell is very much in that tradition of economists who emphasize the importance of understanding the unintended consequences of government actions.
Okay, so in Chapter 5, we get into the world of international trade. And this is another area where Sowell challenges some common assumptions. He argues that free trade is ultimately beneficial for all countries involved, even if it leads to job losses in certain sectors. I have to admit, I was a little skeptical of this at first.
It's a common reaction. Many people fear that free trade will lead to their jobs being outsourced to countries with lower wages. But Sowell argues that trade is not a zero-sum game where one country wins at the expense of another. Instead, he explains that trade allows countries to specialize in what they do best, leading to greater efficiency and overall wealth creation.
Okay, help me wrap my head around that. How can losing jobs in one sector be a good thing for the economy as a whole?
Well, think of it this way. Let's say a country is really good at producing cars, and another country is really good at producing coffee. If they specialize in their respective strengths and trade with each other, they both end up with more cars and more coffee than they would have had if they tried to produce everything themselves.
So even though some people might lose their jobs in the car industry, in the coffee-producing country, the overall economy benefits because everyone has access to cheaper and more abundant goods.
Exactly. And those workers who lost their jobs in the car industry can potentially find new jobs in other sectors that are expanding as a result of trade. Of course, there are always transitional costs and challenges associated with economic shifts, but Sowell argues that the long-term benefits of free trade outweigh those costs.
He also debunks some common myths about international trade, like the idea that rich countries can't compete with low-wage countries.
Right. He points out that wages are only one factor in determining competitiveness. Things like productivity, technology, and infrastructure also play a crucial role. And in many cases, higher wage countries can actually be more competitive because their workers are more skilled and productive.
He also argues that trade restrictions, like tariffs, often end up hurting the very people they're intended to protect.
Absolutely. He gives the example of the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which were enacted in the U.S. in the 1930s with the intention of protecting American jobs. But they actually backfired, triggering a trade war that deepened the Great Depression and ultimately led to even more job losses.
So by trying to protect domestic industries from foreign competition, governments can actually end up harming their own economies.
Exactly. And this is a recurring theme in Sowell's work. He constantly reminds us to be wary of the unintended consequences of well-intentioned policies.
So we've covered a lot of ground in just the first 5 chapters, from the basic principles of economics to the role of prices, profits and losses, government intervention, and international trade. So really lays a solid foundation for understanding how the world works.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore in basic economics, from the role of financial markets and risk to the complexities of economic development and the impact of cultural values.
We'll definitely be diving deeper into all of that in the next part of our deep dive. So until next time, keep those economic gears turning.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Thomas Sowell's basic economics. We've already covered a lot of ground, but Sowell's insights just keep on coming. In this next section, we're going to delve deeper into some of the real-world applications of those economic principles we discussed in Part 1.
I'm excited to see how these ideas play out in real-life scenarios. And in Chapter 6, Sowell jumps right into a topic that I think is super relevant today: the relationship between productivity and pay. I know a lot of people feel like they work really hard, but don't get rewarded fairly for their efforts. Does Sowell address that?
He certainly does, and he challenges some common misconceptions about how wages are determined. He argues that in a competitive market, wages are ultimately tied to productivity. In other words, workers tend to be paid in proportion to the value they create for their employers.
Okay, so if I want to earn more money, I need to find a way to become more productive. But how do we even measure productivity, especially in jobs where the output isn't always tangible?
That's a great question. And Sowell acknowledges that measuring productivity can be tricky, especially in service-based economies. But he argues that the market as a whole tends to find ways to assess the relative value of different types of work. For example, if a company is willing to pay a software engineer a higher salary than a customer service representative, it's likely because they perceive the software engineer's work to be more valuable to the company's success.
So it's not just about how hard you work, but about the skills, knowledge, and experience you bring to the table, and how those contribute to creating value for your employer.
Exactly. And this has some important implications for education and job training. Sowell argues that investing in human capital is essential for increasing productivity and raising wages over long term.
So instead of just demanding higher wages, workers should focus on acquiring the skills and knowledge that will make them more valuable to employers.
That's a key takeaway from Sowell's analysis. And it also highlights the role of entrepreneurs and businesses in driving economic growth by finding innovative ways to increase productivity and create new products and services. They create more opportunities for workers to earn higher wages.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like a virtuous cycle. Businesses invest in innovation, which creates more value, which leads to higher wages, which in turn fuels more economic activity.
Precisely. And Sowell argues that this cycle is most likely to flourish in a free market environment, where individuals and businesses are free to experiment, take risks, and reap the rewards of their efforts.
Okay, let's move on to Chapter 7, where Sowell tackles a topic that's often shrouded in mystery, the role of financial markets. I'll admit I find this stuff a bit intimidating.
I think a lot of people do. But Sowell does a great job of demystifying financial markets, explaining how they work and why they're so important for economic growth. At their core, financial markets are all about connecting savers with borrowers.
So people who have extra money they want to invest, and people who need capital to start or expand a business.
Exactly. And financial institutions like banks and investment firms act as intermediaries, facilitating those connections and channeling capital to its most productive uses. Sowell explains how stock markets, bond markets, and other financial instruments allow businesses to raise capital, diversify risk, and invest in long-term projects that would be impossible to fund otherwise.
He also talks about the role of interest rates, right? I know they play a big part in how much it costs to borrow money, but I'm not always clear on how those rates are determined.
Sowell explains that interest rates are essentially the price of money, just like prices for goods and services are determined by supply and demand. Interest rates are influenced by the supply of savings and the demand for loans. When savings are plentiful, interest rates tend to be lower, making it cheaper to borrow money. When savings are scarce, interest rates tend to be higher, making borrowing more expensive.
That makes sense. And it highlights the importance of saving right. The more people save, the more capital there is available for businesses to invest and grow the economy.
Absolutely. Sowell is a strong advocate for saving, both at the individual and societal level. He sees it as a key driver of economic growth and prosperity over the long term.
Now, I know Sowell is often critical of government intervention in the economy, but he does acknowledge that financial markets need some level of regulation, right?
He does. He recognizes that markets aren't perfect and that there are always risks of fraud, abuse, and instability. But he cautions against excessive regulation that can stifle innovation, discourage investment, and create unintended consequences.
So it's all about finding the right balance, enough regulation to protect investors and ensure the stability of the financial system, but not so much that it chokes off economic activity.
Exactly. And that's a recurring theme in Sowell's work. He's always looking for that sweet spot where markets can operate freely, but within a framework of rules that promote fairness, transparency, and accountability.
Okay, let's move on to Chapter 8, where Sowell delves into the complex world of economic development. I think a lot of people, myself included, wonder why some countries seem to struggle with poverty and underdevelopment, while others experience rapid economic growth. What are some of the key factors that Sowell identifies?
Sowell argues that there's no single magic bullet for economic development. It's a multifaceted process that involves a complex interplay of factors, including geography, culture, institutions, and government policies. He emphasizes that while geography can set limits and present opportunities, it's ultimately human choices and actions that determine a nation's economic trajectory.
So a country's destiny isn't predetermined by its natural resources or location.
Not at all. Sowell points to numerous examples of countries with abundant natural resources that have remained poor, while others with few resources have become prosperous. He argues that factors like property rights, a stable legal system, a well-educated workforce, and a culture that values entrepreneurship and innovation are far more important than simply having access to raw materials.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like having all the ingredients for a delicious meal, but lacking the skills and knowledge to actually cook it.
Exactly. And Sowell is particularly critical of what he calls the myth of the underdeveloped world. He argues that many developing countries aren't inherently poor or backward. They've simply been held back by misguided government policies, corruption, and cultural factors that discourage investment and entrepreneurship.
So what are some of the policies that Sowell recommends for promoting economic development?
He emphasizes the importance of creating an environment where individuals and businesses are free to pursue their own interests, guided by the signals of the market. This means securing property rights, reducing bureaucratic hurdles, promoting free trade, and fostering a culture of entrepreneurship and innovation.
It sounds like a lot of what we've already discussed. Limited government,
Right.
free markets, and a focus on individual initiative.
Exactly. Sowell sees these principles as universal keys to unlocking economic potential, regardless of a country's starting point.
Okay, now in Chapter 9, Sowell takes on a topic that's often fraught with emotion: the issue of discrimination and its impact on economic outcomes. I know this is a sensitive area, so how does Sowell approach it?
Sowell approaches this topic with his characteristic intellectual rigor and nuance, challenging simplistic explanations that attribute all economic disparities to discrimination. He acknowledges that discrimination exists and has real consequences, but argues that it's not the sole or even primary explanation for group differences in economic outcomes.
So he's saying that while discrimination can certainly create barriers, it's not the only factor at play.
Right. Sowell points out that many groups have faced discrimination throughout history, yet some have managed to overcome those obstacles and achieve economic success, while others have struggled. He argues that cultural factors, such as attitudes towards education, work ethic, and entrepreneurship play a significant role in determining economic outcomes.
So he's not denying the impact of discrimination, but he's saying we need to look beyond simple explanations and consider the complex interplay of factors that contribute to economic success or failure.
Exactly, and this is where Sowell's emphasis on empirical evidence and historical context comes in. He provides numerous examples of groups that have faced discrimination, but have nonetheless thrived economically, often by focusing on areas where they faced less discrimination, or by developing cultural values that promoted economic advancement.
He also challenges the notion that all group differences in economic outcomes are necessarily the result of injustice or exploitation.
Right. He points out that some disparities may be due to differences in skills, experience, risk aversion, or cultural preferences, for example. He notes that groups that have historically been involved in occupations requiring higher levels of education or risk-taking, such as entrepreneurship, may have higher average incomes than groups that have traditionally gravitated towards lower-risk, lower-paying jobs.
It's a reminder that economics is about understanding incentives and choices, and that those choices are often shaped by a complex mix of cultural
It's historical.
or economic factors.
Absolutely. And Sowell encourages us to approach this topic with intellectual honesty, recognizing that simple explanations often fail to capture the complexity of real-world economic disparities.
Okay, in Chapter 10, Sowell gets into the world of politics and its impact on the economy. I have a feeling he's not a big fan of politicians meddling in the market.
You're catching on. Sowell is highly critical of what he sees as the politicization of the economy. He argues that politicians often make decisions based on short-term political expediency, rather than sound economic principles.
So they're more concerned with winning the next election than with making policies that will benefit the economy in the long run.
That's often the case, according to Sowell. He argues that politicians are prone to making promises they can't keep, pandering to special interests, and enacting policies that sound good in theory, but have unintended consequences that can harm the very people they're intended to help.
He uses some pretty vivid examples to illustrate this point, like price controls, subsidies, and protectionist trade policies.
Right. He shows how these policies, while often presented as solutions to economic problems, can actually exacerbate those problems by distorting markets, creating inefficiencies, and discouraging investment.
So what's the solution according to Sowell? How can we prevent politics from undermining the economy?
Sowell advocates for a more limited role for government in the economy, arguing that the best way to promote economic growth and prosperity is to allow markets to operate freely, guided by the signals of prices and profits.
So less government intervention, more individual initiative, and a focus on creating a stable and predictable framework for economic activity.
Exactly. That's the essence of Sowell's message. He believes that when individuals and businesses are free to pursue their own interests, within a framework of clear rules and strong property rights, they will create more wealth, innovation, and opportunity for everyone.
Now, I know Sowell is often criticized for being too idealistic, or for ignoring the role of power and inequality in shaping economic outcomes. How does he respond to those criticisms?
Sowell acknowledges that the world is a complex place, and that there are always going to be imbalances of power and wealth. But he argues that those imbalances are often exacerbated by government interventions that attempt to engineer social or economic outcomes. He believes that the best way to address inequality is to focus on creating a level playing field, where everyone has the opportunity to succeed based on their own merits, rather than trying to redistribute wealth through government programs.
So instead of focusing on outcomes, Sowell is saying we should focus on creating a fair and transparent system where everyone has the chance to succeed based on their own effort and ingenuity.
Exactly. He sees that as the most ethical and effective way to promote economic justice and opportunity for all.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive, from productivity and pay to the role of financial markets, economic development, discrimination, and the impact of politics on the economy. Sowell really takes us on a whirlwind tour through the complexities of the economic world.
And he does it all with his trademark clarity
Our logic.
and unwavering commitment to challenging conventional wisdom.
I have to say, this book has really opened my eyes to the power of economic principles to explain how the world works. And I think it's given me some valuable tools for analyzing current events and making more informed decisions in my own life.
That's the beauty of Sowell's work. It's not just theoretical, it's highly applicable to the real world.
Well, I'm definitely looking forward to diving into the final section of Basic Economics. I have a feeling Sowell has even more insights in store for us.
Welcome back to our deep dive into basic economics. We've explored a vast landscape of economic principles, from the power of prices to the role of government, and so much more. In this final part, I think it's time we zoom out and look at the big picture. How do all these ideas come together to shape the world we live in?
That's a great way to frame it.
Yeah.
In these last few chapters of Basic Economics, Sowell really encourages us to think about the long-term consequences of economic decisions and how they impact not just individuals but entire societies.
Absolutely. And in Chapter 11, he dives into a topic that's often overlooked in traditional economic textbooks: the role of history and culture in shaping economic outcomes. He argues that we can't fully understand the present without understanding the past.
That reminds me of a quote I read recently. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Exactly. And Sowell provides some fascinating examples of how historical patterns and cultural values have influenced economic development in different parts of the world. For instance, he compares the economic trajectories of European colonies in North America and South America.
Okay, that's interesting. I've always wondered why those regions, despite having similar colonial histories, ended up on such different economic paths.
Sowell argues that while both regions were initially exploited for their resources, the North American colonies developed a more individualistic and entrepreneurial culture that fostered economic growth over the long term.
So it wasn't just about geography or natural resources, but about the cultural values and institutions that took root in those societies.
Precisely. And this highlights a key theme in Sowell's work: the importance of human capital. He argues that the knowledge, skills, and attitudes of a population are ultimately the most valuable resources for economic growth.
That makes sense, after all. Even the most abundant natural resources are useless without people who know how to extract, process,
And transform them into valuable goods and services.
Exactly. And Sowell points out that investing in education, healthcare, and other forms of human capital development is essential for long-term economic prosperity.
Now, in Chapter 12, Sowell gets into a topic that's always in the news: income inequality. I know this is a complex issue with a lot of different perspectives. How does Sowell approach it?
Sowell, as always, brings a data-driven perspective to the discussion. He acknowledges that income inequality exists, but he cautions against simplistic explanations that attribute it solely to factors like greed, exploitation, or discrimination.
So he's not saying that those factors don't play a role, but he's arguing that there's more to the story. Exactly. He points out that income inequality is a natural consequence of a dynamic economy where people have different skills, talents, risk tolerances, and work ethics. He argues that trying to eliminate inequality through redistributionist policies can actually backfire by disincentivizing work, investment, and innovation.
So instead of focusing on redistributing wealth, Sowell is suggesting that we focus on creating an environment where everyone has the opportunity to succeed based on their own merits.
That's a key takeaway from his analysis. He believes that the best way to reduce poverty and promote upward mobility is to create a level playing field with equal opportunities for education, entrepreneurship, and personal advancement.
Now, I know some people criticize Sowell for being too focused on individual responsibility and not giving enough weight to systemic factors that contribute to inequality. How would you respond to that critique?
So certainly emphasizes individual agency. But he's not blind to the role of systemic factors. He acknowledges that historical injustices, institutional biases, and cultural norms can create barriers for certain groups. But he argues that even within those constraints, individuals still have choices to make, and that fostering a culture of self-reliance, hard work, and personal responsibility is crucial for overcoming those obstacles.
It's a nuanced perspective that recognizes the complexity of the issue. He's not saying that we should ignore systemic problems, but he's also saying that we shouldn't underestimate the power of individual initiative.
Exactly. And this leads us to one of the most profound insights in basic economics. The idea that economic principles are like laws of nature, predictable and consistent. Sowell argues that if we understand these principles, we can make better decisions, both individually and collectively, that lead to greater prosperity and well-being.
That's a powerful idea. It suggests that economics isn't just some abstract academic subject. It's a practical tool for understanding the world and making informed choices.
Absolutely. And in the final chapter, Sowell challenges us to apply these economic principles to the real world, to think critically about the issues of the day, and to engage in constructive dialogue about how to create a more prosperous and just society.
So he's not just giving us a set of answers. He's inviting us to join the conversation and use these tools to think for ourselves.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes basic economics such an enduring and valuable work. It empowers readers to become informed citizens, to see the world through an economic lens, and to engage in reasoned debate about the challenges we face.
Well, I have to say, this deep dive into basic economics has been an incredible journey. I've learned so much. And I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of how the economy works.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you, and I hope our listeners have found this deep dive equally enlightening.
I'm sure they have. Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics is a book that everyone should read. It's clear, insightful, and thought-provoking. It's a book that will stay with you long after you finish the last page.
And that's what makes a truly great book, the power to change the way you see the world.
Until next time, keep those economic gears turning.